We are pleased now to have Whitney McIntyre Miller. Dr. McIntyre Miller is an associate professor of leadership studies at Chapman University, who centers her scholarship on peace leadership and community development leadership. And she publishes a lot in those fields. She has experience in community international development, refugee resettlement, nonviolence, and elections monitoring. She is the co-director of the Chapman University Panther Experiential Philanthropy Project and on the Los Alamitos Unified School District Human Relations Advisory Council, and has served the co-convener of the International Leadership Association's Peace Leadership Affinity Group and as a Community Development Society board member. Well, you're doing a lot of things. I hope you give yourself a break once in a while. I have to talk to you about your refugee resettlement work, because I do a lot of that in my NGO, do experiential education, teaching college students how to work in conflict zones as refugee aid workers. So I have to talk. So anyhow, I want to turn it over then to Whitney for, well, at least 45 minutes, because she should have that like everyone else, and then maybe some questions afterwards. And then we can have her, Whitney wants to take questions as she's doing or doing it in the midst of it. It's fine, whatever works. And then after that, we'll take some more questions. I'll come back to close it out, and then we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. So Whitney, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here and to see you all, and happy Friday to each of you. So wishing you a smooth transition into the weekend. Hopefully you have some breaks planned. I know that's always important, particularly in a conference when you've been in front of Zoom all day. Our International Leadership Association conference was, I think, about a week and a half ago, and we had 3 days of full days of Zoom, and I've been there. So I appreciate how that is. Thank you so much.
I do this intentionally. I do this 2 hours at a time. I do that
so much better.
Yeah.
I mean, because it was international. One night I was presenting till 8 p.m. my time, and then was up at 5 a.m. for another session. Because it was just a whole, this is great. What y'all are doing is great. So I'm really happy to be here and to connect with you all. I have some slides that I plan to share, but I'm happy to engage in conversation. I think that is really what is the most interesting about a lot of these sort of sessions together, is to really sort of think about how we can move work in peace forward together. So before I share my slides, because once they share, I can't see you all, and I have very strong aversion to Zoom sharing, but it is what it is. So I'd like to see you all first. But I'm hoping if you just would take a second, if you wouldn't mind, in the chat, sort of introducing yourself. I'm not sure we have enough time for everyone to go around in the circle, but if you wouldn't just mind sort of putting your name and what you do and where you come from in the chat, it'd be great for me to sort of meet you a little bit. As David said, I'm at Chapman University, which is in Orange, California. For those of you who aren't familiar, we can see the Disneyland fireworks from our campus. So that gives you a sense. Most folks have an idea of where Disneyland is. We're really pretty close to Disneyland. So, so that's kind of where we're situated. We have a long history of peace studies at Chapman University, and also leadership studies as well. And I see myself really sort of serving in the nexus of those two spaces. So a lot of my teaching is in the leadership studies side of things, but a lot of my scholarship is on peace leadership and community development and leadership. So that is where I spend my time when I can. I merge the two. We do have a peace leadership class. We have a peace and sustainability leadership class. And when things are going really well, we get to do study abroads on peace and leadership and sustainability. Of course, we have not done that for 2 years, but I have my fingers crossed that a third time is a charm, and we'll be going to Iceland this summer with Chapman students. So fingers crossed, we shall see. But I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about my work in integral peace leadership. I hope that it's something that could be useful for you all in your life, in your teaching, in your research, in the way that you sort of do the work that you do. So my plan is to sort of present to you a little bit about integral peace leadership, talk to you about kind of how it came about, give you the quick overview. I'm happy to answer any questions you have as we go, but then maybe we have a little bit of time to talk at the end. I have some ideas on how peace leadership can be beneficial to folks working in community college settings. I have a feeling that you have even better ideas about that than I do. So I'd rather hear from you than for you hear from me, since you all are doing that work in that space. So that is my plan for us for the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. Thank you all so much for putting your information in the chat. It's nice for me to see you and get to know you a bit, especially because now that I'm going to share my screen, I'm never going to see you again, or at least not for a while. Okay. So here we go. The ultimate in never seeing you again. Hopefully the presentation will pick up here and you'll be able to see a slide of a lovely succulent there. Looks good. Everybody can see just the slide, okay? Or do you see all my notes too, or it's okay? Good. I'm gonna assume it's good unless somebody tells me it's not.
We're seeing
Okay.
like part of your presentation is
thing?
what we're
So
seeing the whole
weird.
thing.
Use slideshow. Let's try this. My everything just went black.
There.
How about this?
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm telling you, this is the bane of my existence. So I appreciate you bearing with me here. You'd think after what, almost 2 years of existing solely on Zoom, any of us will have figured it out, but unfortunately not me. And I feel like I'm fairly adept at technology, but maybe inept is the better word. Okay, so talking about integral peace leadership here. And like I said, I'm going to try to not be too much of a talking head, so please do feel free to interject and ask questions. But I see my work, as I had mentioned, really is the intersection of leadership and peace. My PhD is in leadership studies, but my master's degrees are in international development and in social work. And so you can sort of see how I bring most of those to the table here in the way that I think about this work. You'll recognize Galtung as an influence in sort of my thinking on peace and defining peace. And then there's lots of folks who sort of influence this idea of individual and collective practices for just change, as thinking about leadership as more than just a power position or authoritarian position, of really being a space where anyone can engage in leadership at any given time. So the idea here is that that sort of all of us are able to be invited into this practice. And that's how I've sort of framed my thinking on leadership and on peace. Let's see if it'll let me go ahead. There we go. So many years ago, maybe not many, 7, feels like many, some colleagues and I really spent some time with Ken Wilber's integral theory model. For those of you who are not familiar with Wilber, his integral theory model, he really started working on in the 90s and published an initial book in 2000. It's a 4-quadrant model that focuses on sort of the inner work of ourselves, the sort of knowledge, behaviors, and practices and skills that it takes to engage in this work, the it quadrant, the top right, the spaces where we exist in community and we build sort of in groups and social spaces, which is the bottom left, and then the larger system structures and environmental pieces at play. And we were really interested in how we might plot the literature and the learning of both peace studies and leadership studies into integral theory, because the idea was sort of for us was it makes a lot of sense for us to think about how peace studies and leadership studies overlap, right? And so we have a lot of folks who do work in peace that lead, right? So we know we can look at peace leaders in terms of peace movements or folks who've been involved in reconciliation efforts, these sort of things, right? But in leadership, we didn't really talk a lot about peace. Leadership was sort of this, you kind of do what you do to further your organization, but there wasn't really a larger goal at the point. And so in leadership studies, we started talking as early as 2009 about this idea of leadership for what? Why do we do it if not for peace? And so our idea was really thinking about how that we could combine these things together. So what we did was we really plotted a lot of the literature into these 4, what Wilber calls quadrants. Now, we all know that they are not separate in a lot of ways, right? The things that we might plot in one doesn't exist only in one space. And so ultimately, we really started envisioning peace leadership as sort of these nested components that are overlapped together, because this static 4-quadrant model didn't really work for us. And so really what you see here is sort of this like fancy vision that we have of sort of the notion of all of the work in these areas combining. So in the inner work, we're really focusing on those sort of internal practices that we need to engage in peace work. So what that looks like can be different for lots of folks, but meditation, understanding our own worldviews, ways that we can sort of prepare ourselves to do the work that we want to do in order to move peace forward. In the knowledge section, we see a lot of the sort of theories and practices that we're used to understanding, right? So we see the ideas of sort of conflict transformation, negotiation, mediation, some of the real like clear practices, nonviolent communication that make this work possible. In the community section, we see the work that involves in bringing folks together, like-minded folks and folks who might think differently than us, and how we can sort of build capacity in those spaces. And then finally, in the environment section, we really sort of think overarchingly about what it is like to challenge some of those systems and structures that exist, how it is that we can push some of the policies and practices and procedures. If the idea is really to bring about equitable and just change, we obviously know that we need to deconstruct a lot of our existing systems and structures and really think about ways that we can build new systems and structures that work for everyone as opposed to just those privileged few. And so really the notion for us has been that peace leadership is sort of the nexus of all of those pieces together, working together to try to find that space. So we define integral peace leadership, this work that we've been working on for a while, as a proactive, intentional approach of individual and collective action that challenges violence and aggression and creates positive, just change. Super easy, right? We can all just do it, not a problem. So we realize that this is a grandiose, sort of very hopeful idea, right? Perhaps optimistic too, but I'm going to go with hope as opposed to optimistic, because I feel like there are spaces where we can see that this has been effective and that it does work. And so our plan and the way that we've been building this together has been thinking about how do we create this theory of integral peace leadership that actually explains how peace leadership can be built and can be maintained in communities and organizations and spaces all over the world. So a lot of the work to this point in time in our trajectory since 2015 is when we really began some of this work, has been sort of this theoretical development, which is all great and good, but so what? Like, who really cares, right? Those of you who are faculty members know that we get accused all the time of like sitting in our beautiful little offices and thinking a lot and not doing a lot for the rest of the world. Anyone who does any work around theory gets this question all the time. Why does it matter? What can we do with this? And so really what we've been trying to do is to understand the relationship between theory and practice, right? Because it's super great to think all these heady ideas and pat yourself on the back, like, oh, look at us, like we thought good things, and nothing ever happens with them, but then really sort of creating what we consider a cycle of theory and practice. And so we've moved into this understanding of how this theory and these ideas play out in the real world, because that's what matters the most. It doesn't matter sort of what theory says if it's not based in reality. And we need the reality to help us define the theory so that we can get better in sort of our training and development and other programs that we do. So far, I think I'm gonna sneeze. Oh, maybe not, okay. It's gonna come, don't be surprised if it happens. So far we've done some 4 really interesting projects to really think about the cycle of theory and practice in terms of integral peace leadership. In 2017, we had a peace leadership collaborative that took place in Santa Ana, California, for those of you who are familiar, where we worked with a group of community peace builders and created a curriculum that did a training for these folks about peace leadership and how they could use peace leadership in their work and practice. And the idea was really to present the concepts of peace leadership. And I'm going to share you in the next slide a few of what those look like. And then to really sort of understand and unpack which of these are relevant to the work that they are doing and which are not, right? Because that's sort of the idea that we're trying to build. And in this space, we're really happy to report that we saw a lot of advancement in terms of knowledge of skill, use of skill and practice from our pre-post test and from our conversations with the people involved in that pilot. We also did a second pilot of a peace leadership curriculum where we worked with peace leadership professionals, peace leadership faculty, and peace leadership students in doing this other sort of piece where we could understand how the ideas and practices of peace leadership could connect to. Something else that we're happy to work with, if you're not familiar with the University of San Diego's Women Peacemaker narratives, I would encourage you to view them. There are 48, now potentially 54 narratives that were written by women about women in the peace building field. They exist from every continent and from many different countries. I can't remember off the top of my head, I think at least 30 different countries. And these are amazing narratives of these women's lives. So I would encourage you as students or as faculty or administrators to sort of look at these narratives and read about these incredible women who are doing amazing work around the world. And so we've been very fortunate to have access to each of those narratives for research purposes as well, and have been able to do some coding and some understanding of how peace leadership plays out in the University of San Diego Women Peacemakers narrative as well. And then finally, our current ongoing work, and I'm really happy that Fran Favaz is a part of this work as well, is working with the Euphrates Institute's Peace Practice Alliance. We were very fortunate that the Euphrates Institute actually found the Integral Peace Leadership and used the Integral Peace Leadership to create as a foundation for their Peace Practice Alliance, which is a 6-month virtual training program for peace builders around the world. So far, 48 peace builders have been trained from 22 different countries using the Integral Peace Leadership as a framework. So we've really been able to create an amazing partnership with Euphrates Institute. We are so grateful for them and for our ability to connect with the learning that they are doing with these peace builders in 22 different countries around the world to really understand integral peace leadership in practice in community spaces. So with that, I thought it would be important for us to give you some ideas that have emerged from this as ideas that are really resonant with the Women Peace Builders, with the Euphrates Peace Practice Alliance alumni, with the Santa Ana alumni, and with our peace leadership curriculum folks that we've been talking with. So over the last 5 years, we have created and confirmed and reconfirmed and sort of build this space around peace leadership to really understand what falls under each of these 4 categories and how they sort of combine together. So it'd be no surprise to many of you, a lot of these skills are likely things that you would, if I would ask you what would fall under inner work or what would follow under these knowledge categories, that you would be able to tell me most of these skills and practices. You teach them every day, you learn them, you engage in them. So our work isn't necessarily shattering amazing ideas that no one's ever thought of before, but what we're really trying to do is pull a lot of these spaces that we've worked on in peace and in leadership together in a model and an idea and a framework that really sort of provides space for us to bring in all of our strengths. And so in the inner work area, we have ideas like empathy, I mentioned already, mediation or meditation. We've got although that does say mediation, mindfulness and mediation, should say meditation. Deep listening, love, authenticity, human dignity in our knowledge areas, or in our inner work areas, our knowledge areas, space for understanding those theories and practices, things like nonviolent communication, creativity, which I think is so important, dialogue, reconciliation, peace building practices. In our community spaces, the way that we foster community spaces for collective action, we see diversity and equity work, coalition building, establishing trust, adaptive leadership, particularly if you're unfamiliar with Heifetz's work. Heifetz's work is really great in this space as well. And then environment is our social structures and systems areas where we see these larger nonviolent social movements, advocacy, activism. We consider ideas of distributed leadership as opposed to sort of authoritative top-down type leadership, focusing on chaos theory and Simon Western's model of eco-leadership, which is a intentionally collectivist sort of mode of leadership. So if you're unfamiliar with that, I would encourage you to look at Simon Western's work too. He's got some really interesting pieces on how we can build leadership in spaces of collective action. But the idea here for us too is that in integral peace leadership, we're thinking about how it is that we can do all of these things at the same time, which we understand is a near impossibility. And so what we really need to do is understand that we cannot be doing all these things all the time. It's not feasible for any of us. But what we have found is when we look at case studies, when we look at the women peacemakers who are successful in these efforts, what we see is that each of them are doing something from each of these 4 spaces in the work that they are doing. And there's not necessarily a perfect formula that we could give you, a checklist of if you're doing these 4 things, whatever change you're trying to make in terms of your building peace into your community is going to work. If we could do that, that would be amazing. If you all have figured out a checklist to bring about peaceful, just change in communities, please let me know. I would love to see it. But what we are doing is realizing that when all 4 of these areas are present in some capacity, then that is when we see this peaceful, just change build, which is what we have not seen. And there's plenty of cases that we can look at too that really share with us when that has not been successful, right? When peace has not been achieved, we see that oftentimes 1 or 2 of these areas is missing in that peace effort. So these cases of showing us exactly when some of these areas are missing are also adding to this idea that in order for this positive change to happen, we see that something from each of these 4 areas is being built into those spaces. So I wanted to pause here. I'm going to pause our share here and get out so we can have a chat, and then I will come back to this. But so our ideas here is really sort of the integration of these pieces. So we really want to understand sort of how it is that we can build spaces for these to come together for this work to happen. And then another idea we have is for you in particular. So you all are based in community colleges in some capacity and really thinking about the work that this might bring. And I've got a couple slides about my ideas of how this can be beneficial to the work that you all are doing. But I wanted to pause at this point in time here to see if there are any questions or other ideas that folks want to share before we engage in that conversation.
Yeah, go ahead and just open your mics like we've been doing. You've got a question for Whitney or an observation? Go ahead, Stacy. Oh, Stacy, close your mic. Go ahead, Stacy.
That was an accident.
Do you want to, oh, it was an accident? Okay. Anyone?
Oh, I lost you all.
Well, Whitney, why don't you ask us some questions maybe?
Easy enough then. Okay. So rather than putting up the PowerPoint again so we can see each other, unless you really want to see it, then I'm happy to share it with you too. I wanted to ask you all sort of what you perceive as how we could build peace leadership into community college spaces for students, for faculty, for administrators. I've got some ideas, but I'd love to hear your ideas, some of the things that I've been sort of thinking and grappling with. And like I said, you all are the experts, so I trust you sort of in this space. Is sort of the ideas of how we can build upon these practices to engage in more peaceful individual and collective action. For me, this is something that's really important. I think about these ideas of these 4 quadrants and how they interact pretty much all the time to a fault of my family, they might tell you, especially my 9-year-old son who rolls his eyes every time I say, well, we could really find a way to reframe this. He's like, oh, mom, like, stop. But I think that there's really a lot of sort of engagement that I like to do, especially when I'm coming up against something that's really challenging to me, an individual, a situation where I think about how I can reframe it in terms of the 4. So I'd invite us to think about the work that this might involve for us personally. Also sort of the ability of a learning tool in the classroom. We have used integral peace leadership not only as its own class, but also as a way of framing any sort of challenges or large problems that we come up against, is sort of thinking through the 4 quadrant models and leaning through integral peace leadership as a possibility of helping us to think through those challenges. And then finally, and I realize this is probably maybe going to be a stretch, but any of you who are administrators in the room, maybe you would disagree with me, having spent the last year on the faculty senate at Chapman. I've seen lots of administrative challenges, but sort of thinking about how we could use integral peace leadership to make decisions for our community colleges for the administrative level, from departments all the way up to larger systemic change, and how it is that we might be able to think through integral peace leadership as a way to make changes with justice and equity in mind, which I realize might be an ultimate challenge, but one I'm willing to put forth for all of us.
Michael, go ahead. You're muted, Michael.
I mute myself intentionally because I talk too much. Whitney, thank you. You would probably be better equipped, knowing your own quadrants than I, in responding to an inquiry that I would have, and perhaps a commentary. But the inquiry is, how would you propose applying this for diversity, equity, and inclusion work within a structure, which is what almost all of us work within, extremely hierarchical in nature? I am, for your information, a largely retired political science and peace and conflict studies instructor, who has for the past 6 years been an elected trustee at Portland Community College, which is an institution with 60,000 students on 4 campuses and about 4,000 employees. As a trustee, I help oversee a budget of about $440 million per year. Bringing my compass of nonviolence into this hierarchical structure has been an incredible challenge, because my values are not typically shared in a wide way. It's more of a command and control business structure, where oftentimes those who are subordinate to those who are superior live in fear of sticking out, or making comments that might be seen as being questioning of leadership. That's my reality, and I can give you many examples of it, but diversity, equity, inclusion is currently a focus that everyone gives lip service to.
Yeah.
And students, in my experience at Portland Community College, have been more successful in developing responses to involving critical race theory, as well as mechanisms like, you've probably heard of the Fist of Five voting technique. They have integrated that into their student decision-making with very impressive results.
Yeah.
But the administration, as well as the board, of which I'm a part, and I don't consider the board to be administrative. I'm an elected official. I'm not an administrator, right? But neither the administration nor the board has really developed FISTA 5 or other tools which would help to manifest greater respect among differences of opinion. That's my commentary, that's my context. How would you see, in this sort of a context, administrative or board, your integral theory applying?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. You are not alone. I don't know if that makes you feel better or not, but I assure you, you are not alone.
Well,
we
largely
see.
in my context, I
Well,
am.
That's true. That's true. But you being alone in your larger context is not a. I wish it was a unique situation, but unfortunately, we see. I've involved in several different organizations, and we've seen lots of very similar challenges where folks attempting to engage in DEI work have been met with strong reticence from lots of different places. I think if you were to think about it from an integral perspective, so I think, back up and then I'll go there first. I think a lot of leadership scholars would argue that you can't do any work in the integral space unless you start with the personal, interpersonal, inner work category. A lot of folks sort of really lean heavily on that being the first step. And that unless we are able and willing to engage in our own sort of self-reflection and sort of our own sort of space to prepare for this work and engage other people in that work, then none of the rest of the quadrants can come to pass. I actually would push back against that notion and argue that any of the quadrants are a good space to enter. So of course, every situation is unique, every context is unique. But one of the ways that we have found success for folks is actually by building into the community quadrant first. Sort of finding those folks who are able and willing to engage in the work with you and sort of build a space from there. That kind of, if you're looking at it, the right hand or the left hand side of folks, which is really sort of this inner work and community work. Sort of this space for building a community network together, doing the inner work in that space, and then sort of using some of those skills and tools and techniques that particularly as peace studies folks that we know can help sort of shift the needle on that right side of the quadrant. Ideally sort of with the individual piece first in that kind of knowledge space, then ultimately shifting the environmental quadrant. One of the things that we have found from looking at positive and not so positive cases is the shift in the environmental one, as we all know, is no surprise to any of us, right, is the biggest challenge. Every once in a while, and we have a couple examples that I'm not going to be able to think of off the top of my head, but every once in a while we see movement in the environmental quadrant first. If you even look at something like the Paris Climate Agreement, right, whether we, that worked like 7 years ago. Doesn't work so much now, but maybe now Glasgow will get us back there. But sort of these larger systemic changes that then actually push the work that needs to be done in the other quadrants. But we found generally for the work that you're talking about, that's not really the space that needs to shift the needle. It's really in those community spaces that we have found to be most effective. And a lot of times, you're right, folks don't feel comfortable speaking out, right? Especially as one person, really sort of trying to push the conversation. But in finding like-minded folks and even getting a few people who maybe are really close to that middle ground to build some coalitions around, we found then we can sort of filter into other spaces to have some success. But it's a really big challenge, particularly with folks at the top who are not interested or are interested only to pat themselves on the back and not actual real systemic change. We've seen that very often down here as well. And it's definitely been a struggle. Yes, a very big struggle. So that would be my thoughts, would be to sort of find this space within the quadrants that seemed the quote unquote easiest as a way in, which my guess is sort of building that coalition space and then sort of working around from that angle. That's what we've tried to do. We did that at the Los Alamitos Human Relations Task Force, and it had some really great success. We built a coalition. This Human Relations Council's been going for about 3 years. This year, the entire district, a district that was not paying a whole lot of attention to diversity work, actually did implicit bias training, the whole district this year. Within 3 years, we can all make arguments about whether that's enough or not, but it's a step in the right direction. That we saw this group that really sort of pushed. We got some board members on board. We finally got the superintendent on board, and we're slowly seeing some change that happened. But that really happened with a really committed group of folks sort of working in that communities quadrant first.